From what I understand, based on my conversations with the FBI director, all they know right now is this was an individual who hated people of the Mormon faith. And they are trying to understand more about this, how premeditated it was, how much planning went into it, whether he left a note. All of those questions have yet to be answered, but certainly will be answered.
Right. So if you look at the numbers from 2024 alone, of all the people that they cited as right-wing extremists, none, and I mean none, had any political reasoning for attacking or killing victims. One was the case of a man who was a child molester who murdered a young girl. He had 2 swastikas tattoos on him. Therefore, he was a right-wing extremist. Another one was a man who killed his half-brother because he had called the cops on him. That was a case of right-wing extremism because he belonged to a prison gang previously that was a white supremacist gang. None of these affiliations are actually towards republicanism, towards the president. None of them people actually have a record of even voting in many cases. Nonetheless, and yet still, that is considered right-wing extremism. The ADL does not hold the same standard to, let's say, a black gang whose leaders support black power, or a Latino gang, or an illegal alien gang that support La Raza. None of those affiliations are equal. You know who else did not make the 2024 list? Luigi Mangione. They said that there's no evidence that Luigi was a left-winger.
So following the horrific and tragic mass shooting that took place at the Mormon Church in Michigan yesterday, we immediately saw the desperate left-wing attempts to politicize the situation in a number of different ways. First and foremost, by claiming, despite absolutely no evidence to substantiate this, from the very moment that it happened, that clearly this guy must have been a right-wing pro-MAGA terrorist. What's the evidence for that? Trust me, bro, I just know these things, right? Apparently they're psychic or something. Although that should not really be all that surprising, considering we're talking about the same people who still claim that the Charlie Kirk shooter Tyler Robinson was a MAGA Trump supporter. They said the same exact thing about the guy who tried to shoot at the ICE facility last week in Dallas. And of course, let's not forget, these are the same exact people who still believe to this very day that the guy who tried to shoot Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania was actually a Trump supporter, because that makes so much logical sense, right? But let's be completely honest. This is an intentional left-wing strategy anytime you see a case of terrorism, political violence, or even in this case, likely religious violence, which is to deny, deflect, and basically make any distraction that you can for the fact that regardless of whatever happened in this incident, there is truly a rising left-wing epidemic of violence in this country. But hey, look over there. Let's demonize the right. That said, in today's video, I want to show you some of the nonsense they're saying, because it's the same exact strategies over and over again, all the way down to even photoshopping images, much like they did with Tyler Robinson. Hey, let's just spread an online hoax, as well as show you what we do know about the story thus far. Because it does seem, and look, we don't know for sure, but all the evidence is pointing to there's not even necessarily really a political angle to this. This is a mentally ill individual. He was an Iraq war veteran. He might have had PTSD and a number of different things going on there, who had a personal grievance that is laid out in his life with the Mormon Church. And for that reason, he targeted it. So, again, to say it's something about MAGA or even like a Christian extremist who wants to target the Mormons or something like that, I have to say first and foremost, honestly, about this subject, that from the very beginning, whatever even ends up being the full story here, it is a serious stretch to try to associate an attack against a church with MAGA or any type of mainline conservatism in America. Because I understand there are some third position or far-right ideologies that are maybe anti-Christianity, anti-religion, many of these different things. And I also understand, well, some people say Mormons aren't Christians and all this sectarian stuff, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here. Overall, generally speaking in America, the mainstream GOP or conservative movement want more people to go to church, right? The whole stance is, hey, we want Christian values to be more openly espoused in public. We think public prayer and things like that should be considered more acceptable, et cetera, et cetera. So why exactly, even theological differences aside, would a conservative want to target Mormons, right? The people who themselves are often very, at least socially conservative in this country. If you're going to make an argument about an attack against either, you want to say Christians, Mormons, people who identify as Christians, again, I'm not here to get into that whole debate. would that not be proof that the person was likely godless, right? And by the way, as you learn the guy's story, you'll find that out. This doesn't seem to be some type of like Christian extremist that didn't like Mormons. Again, you know, I'm pretty sure it has nothing to do with, oh, like Charlie Kirk was assassinated in Utah, so someone wanted to target Mormons. That motive was a stretch to begin with, but that also seems to be untrue. But anyways, guys, we'll get into all of these details in today's video. First, though, do us a favor, guys. If you support our work, make sure you hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. We greatly appreciate your support. And that said, I mean, let us just show you what's being said, right? Right off the gate. Why is the right so violent? Because allegedly the shooter had American flags in the back of his pickup truck, which Facebook posts seem to indicate he always had there. But apparently, you know, clearly because the American flag is a right-wing symbol, according to these people, biggest self-own of all time, by the way, it must prove that this was a right-wing attack, again, on a Mormon church, right? So that said, let's first of all identify who this shooter was. The New York Post is identifying him as 40-year-old Thomas Jacob Sanford, a U.S. Marine veteran. So I understand in total good faith why they want to frame this as right-wing, because, oh, you know, he's a veteran and he was going hunting and stuff like this. Clearly experience with weapons, experience with guns. But again, the story gets a lot deeper than that. Okay? But of course, immediately right off the gate, what did you see? The attempts to post what appears to be, by all accounts, guys, a photoshopped image, right? Immediately after the Michigan church shooting, Trump implied the gunman was an anti-Christian leftist. Well, inherently, the person who did this was godless, okay? He targeted a church, and by the way, even Christians who disagree with Mormonism know that it is fundamentally anti-Christian to brutally murder the innocent, you know, just again. So yes, it was an anti-Christian, godless individual on some level, okay? That's undeniable. To associate this in any way with Christian theology is, again, just totally insane. But anyways, they're now claiming that the shooter was a white Iraq war veteran who wore a "Make Liberals Cry Again" shirt. This was no left-wing attack. It was homegrown, radicalized from the right. So here we go again, right? When has the right wing ever incited violence against Mormons or even like really espouse resentment for Mormons? Again, don't get me wrong, there's theological disagreements, but frankly, most of the anti-Mormonism in America actually comes from the left wing because they believe Mormons are too socially conservative, right? There's not this culture in the conservative right of, oh, we hate the Mormons, we pick on the Mormons. No, we generally believe Mormons are nice people. And generally speaking, they actually are really nice people, right? There can be religious differences, but it's not an issue of hatred. Like, if anything, right, if you're a super radicalized Christian and you're abusing actual Christian theology, but whatever, we understand what we're saying there, you know, very likely you would expect the attack to come against something like, gee, I don't know, an abortion clinic, a Satanist church, something like that, even maybe like a liberal, fake, progressive Christian quote-unquote church. But no, instead the Mormons, right? What are you talking about, radicalized from the right? But as usual, these people either have no clue what conservatives actually believe or think in this country, or they know and they intentionally just don't care, right? Because that's just something we've been doing for so long, inciting violence against Mormons, right, guys? Anyways, as you can see, here is that picture that they are showing. It features the shooter here with his family and a Trump 2020 Make Liberals Cry Again shirt. Except if you look more carefully here, guys, you can see some weird inconsistencies in the Photoshop, like the shirt is clipping into the hair and all that stuff. And by the way, authorities are currently saying the same thing. As you can see, the Michigan State Police, as reported in preliminary statements, have indicated that the forensic analysis of the shooter's clothing and related images suggests that the Make Liberals Cry Again shirt may have been digitally altered. Obviously, while official reports are pending, this does indeed align with the fact that it does clearly appear to be a digitally altered photo, and at the very least, they have no proof that this is actually real. It likely is fake, but hey, let's just push it everywhere. And much like the Tyler Robinson situation, if we can just convince like half the country, if not more, that, oh, it was a right-winger because I saw it on the internet and I'm digitally illiterate and, you know, I'm falling for the propaganda and all that, then their goal, frankly, is achieved. So you get the idea. Now, that said, let's talk about what we do know thus far about this shooter, because there's a lot of holes to fill in, obviously. But detail number one I'd like to point out is this new interview out of CNN today. where, as you can see, this suspected Michigan church shooter, according to a city council candidate who actually talked to him, knocked on his door days before the horrific attack, called Mormonism, quote, the Antichrist, while speaking with a city council candidate. Now, that said, that does actually point, you could say, to some type of theological motivation. Maybe this guy was a non-Mormon. Maybe he was an evangelical Christian or something like that, who wanted to target because he thought, oh, he used the phraseology of the Antichrist. But as you go down here, I think what you'll begin to notice is that, well, Antichrist, yes, is a concept that does come from Christianity, but much like calling someone the devil, it's also used just colloquially by people in general, right? So not just because you call someone the Antichrist doesn't mean that, you know, you're actually a practicing Christian or something like that. Now, it could be either, but that's why we're going to show you more details here. And here's where I really think the motive becomes clear. This guy, Kris Johns, says he was door knocking last week when he encountered a, quote, extremely friendly Sanford. That is the sad reality of a lot of these cases of mental illness where this person just basically becomes activated. And, you know, people said, oh, he was nice, maybe a little quiet, but nice. And then it turns out there's a lot of demons going on in there, quite literally. Anyways, the two spoke for 20 minutes as Sanford opened up about his time in Iraq and his struggles with drug addiction when he got home. So clearly we already can see, and it's a really sad and tragic situation. It happens, and it needs to be addressed better in this country. I mean, nobody's denying that, right? Someone comes home from war, either they were traumatized by what they saw, or they're lacking purpose now that, you know, they dedicated their years of their life and they don't know what to do now. And so this person had mental issues. He opened up that he struggled with drug addiction. Very likely, maybe something was going on there, PTSD, whatever it is, etc., etc. So already we're understanding the story, right? It's hard to say, even if he wasn't currently addicted to drugs, that certain mental problems were not going on that obviously caused this and likely stemmed from coming home from Iraq. Now, that said, the conversation took a turn, however, when Johns brought up Mormonism. Okay, what exactly went down here? Well, Sanford said he used to be in a relationship with a woman whose family was Mormon. Ding, ding, ding. Again, we don't know the full details here. But that piece alone, to me, is a big giveaway pointing in a certain direction. Which is not, and yeah, he did also bring up anti-LDS talking points, and I get all that. He probably researched this. But the core grievance against the Mormon Church has nothing to do with politics. It likely doesn't even really have anything to do with theology. It's the fact that at some point in his life, he obviously had a problem, right? It's an ex-girlfriend of his. The family was Mormon. Maybe the family didn't accept him because he wasn't Mormon, something like that, right? And this has created a grievance inside of him. And then as a result, and then he goes crazy on Iraq and all these things. And then he's like, okay, basically in his eyes, he's taking his revenge against the Mormons. Now, you can disagree with me, but to me, that honestly seemed like what the motive was in the beginning, right? A lot of these church shootings come from people who are disaffected with that church for some reason or another, right? And then they just go crazy. But anyways, we'll talk more about that in a second. First, I want you to take a listen to what was actually said in this interview.
Make the statement like that Mormons are the Antichrist, which is a shocking statement. And again, this is somebody you're just meeting for the first time. There was anger. I mean, it was a long-standing anger that I'm speculating, but what he did took planning. It also took real motivation and real anger to ultimately do what he did.
And now Johns, in that, he said that there was nothing in that conversation besides some elevated language, some pointed language towards the LDS community here. He said nothing rose to the level where he felt he needed to report that conversation. Now, since this tragedy happened on Sunday, he has been in contact with the FBI and also with the Michigan State Police here.
Now, look, in fairness, this is one person's account. Right? It's an anecdotal retelling of one guy who met him just days before the attack. But what I do find striking and interesting is that, number one, he was a political candidate who was going door knocking in the neighborhood, and they had like a 20-minute conversation. Now, maybe he's not telling the full story here, but thus far, I didn't actually hear anything in this conversation particularly about politics. Right? In other words, Sanford didn't get to sharing any type of like super hardcore, passionate political beliefs he had. And the reason I think that's interesting is because if the guy really was a political extremist, right or left, usually these people are engulfed, right? They're very passionate about their ideas, especially when a political candidate comes to the door and talks about it. And you would think at some point, unless he was just trying to run cover for something, that this would come out, number one. Number two, the other thing I notice is that, again, yes, he did use the phrase Antichrist, but when you look at the guy's life story, he doesn't seem to be some type of, for instance, right, like an evangelical extremist or a Catholic extremist. He seems a lot more like someone who very sadly was a fallen individual. He came home from Iraq, he was on drugs, and then he had all these issues, and he has this like bitter grievance against the Mormon Church, right? Again, seems to me that is the situation here. We don't know for sure. But I'm already seeing, like, where is the actual evidence, first of all, whether the guy was even a Trump supporter or not, right? Because that is not proven whatsoever. But furthermore, that this attack actually had anything to do with politics, right? And last point I like to make, because I honestly forgot to say this in the intro, the big takeaway, by the way, is not that, oh, crazy people exist in the world, because they do. Obviously, they do. The difference between right and left is that this attack was universally condemned on the right wing versus the fact that when it came to Charlie Kirk's assassination, you had at least 50% of leftists, if not more, hundreds of thousands of people going online and openly celebrating his death, basically endorsing the act of political violence. You want to know the difference? You want to know the both sides of this? That's the both sides of this. Now, that said, let us also discuss the other piece of alleged evidence here. This is a developing story, so that's why I say alleged on a lot of things. That reportedly at the guy's house, he had a Trump-Pence sign with a stop sign on top of it. So that's interesting, right? First of all, it was not a Trump-Vance sign. It was a Trump-Pence sign. So even if you want to take that route, it indicates what? He supported Trump years ago? Yeah, much like they tried to say about Tyler Robinson. Oh, if you change your political views from the point where you were young or years later, you have different ones. I mean, what does that show? But secondly, the more important thing about that is, notice it's right on top of a stop sign. So that could mean two things. That could either mean, number one, the stop sign was there and it was a convenient place to mount it. But number two, and I would argue almost more likely here, that's saying he wants to stop Trump and Pence, assuming this is even real. I have not substantiated this thus far. I'm not sure if authorities have confirmed this, but I'm just responding to a piece of evidence a lot of people have shared. So let's assume that is true. This shows nothing. He could have been left wing or right wing. I don't know what it's saying, right? So, just again, something that does not actually back up the narrative here of the left at all, which is why you're seeing some of them understanding that they can't take the blame the right thing and it will go so well because the narrative doesn't actually make sense and it's not backed up by the facts. They're instead saying clearly the story here, right, is gun control. For instance, from Mr. Medhi Hasan, the anti-American lunatic who voluntarily immigrated to the U.S. and then constantly complains about how terrible it is and how not progressive it is, even though he was born in the UK but refuses to go back, even though, I mean, apparently that's the society he wants to live in, right? He wants to live in a place where you have open borders and migrants running around stabbing everyone, and then the police do nothing about it. They also have socialist healthcare. They have a police force that won't do anything. They have hate speech laws. I mean, I'm not sure, and he's a citizen there, so I'm not sure, Medhi, why you don't go back to the paradise that you were born in, because clearly the ideas you push work so well. But anyways, that's besides the point. Let's read what Medhi Hasan said about this. He's, of course, blaming what? Lack of gun control, saying, quote, the response to this from the pro-gun crime GOP will be to offer only, quote, thoughts and prayers, even though these poor innocent people were literally praying as they were gunned down. The GOP remains the party of gun crime and mass shootings. Really? So even when, not in this case, but in other cases recently, left-wing terrorists commit mass shootings or they commit gun crimes, that's the Republicans' fault. Why? Gun control. Oh, but Tyler Robinson used his grandfather's inherited family heirloom that was a World War I era Mauser. How would gun control have even stopped that? Shut up! You just want kids to die. You're the party of gun crime and mass shootings, guys. Except, as we've had to say in a lot of these cases, there's just one problem with that, and it's the fact that Michigan is ran by who? Yeah, Gretchen Whitmer, a Democrat, okay? They have an entire Democrat triplex in basically all of the state executive positions, like, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, things like that. But furthermore, sure, it now has a divided government, but I would like to note, even had a Democrat trifecta, right? Basically, Democrat governor, Democrat state house, Democrat state senate, all the way up until the 2024 election, and then they were inaugurated at the start of 2025. So this is to say, Democrats have had control of the state. They've had many chances to pass gun control. In some cases, they have. And yet, the gun control didn't work, and this guy who was an Iraq war veteran got the gun anyway and did the stuff anyway. But somehow that's the fault of Republicans. It's the same thing with Minnesota, right? That's especially true there, where Tim Walz and a Democrat supermajority runs the entire state, and then someone commits a mass shooting in their state, and they say, this is because Republicans won't pass gun control. Where's your responsibility? What are you doing? Oh, it's almost as if your stupid laws don't actually work, and your agenda anytime someone is shot is just to stand here and virtue signal at us to pass policies that fundamentally actually make America more dangerous. But if we don't support them, as usual, we're just bad people, right? If we don't, it's the same thing. If we don't support BLM burning down half the country and policies that will, allow all the criminals out into the streets and then defund the police, we're just bad people. We're racist. As usual, this is always the stupid game that they play. It is ridiculous. It is nonsense, but you know the story there, right? We further have no idea, by the way, if gun control would have stopped this. We don't know what the motive actually was here. We have an idea. It doesn't seem to be political, but furthermore, right? And of course, it further ignores the key part of this story in which, first of all, the shooter drove the truck into the Mormon Church, right? Big vehicle, basically. Where's the ban on assault trucks? Secondly, are you forgetting the fact that the reason why the scene ended in this is because he placed IEDs, improvised explosive devices that he likely learned how to make in the military, and, you can put together using certain household ingredients and buy it, Where's the control on that? So, I mean, even if he didn't have the gun, please explain to me how this could have prevented some type of mass casualty event. Because 2 out of the 3 ways he did it didn't involve guns. They don't care. They're just completely bad faith, scumbag individuals. It's further worth noting, by the way, that LDS churches, according to apparently their current statutes, are actually gun-free zones. LDS churches, as you can see, do not permit weapons on premises. Firearms and other lethal weapons are not allowed on church property. This includes concealed weapons, and that does not apply to current law enforcement officers. So basically, they don't want citizens to be concealed carrying within the churches. So that's gun control. By the way, I think that's a policy the Mormon Church should change for the protection of the churchgoers, right? But anyways, that's gun control. Why didn't it work? Oh, they don't care. Let's just, these bad faith scumbags will just accost our character, even though one could argue it's the opposite. Like, their policies allowed this to happen. But, it is what it is. That said, guys, let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. Where do you think the motive is pointing here? And what do you think of the left-wing attempts to claim it's right-wing or even inherently political to begin with? Let me know. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and until next time, God bless and peace.